a fund set up by the Association of Consultant Architects in consultation with members of the Lyons family. The trustees are Gordon Graham and Richard Lyons and John Partridge. And the fund is designed to assist in the advancement of architectural education. And to further this aim, the Trust will award scholarships and prizes to students and intending students of architecture and sponsor lectures on architecture. And this, of course, is the first. I'm absolutely delighted to be associated with this first lecture. I have very fond and vivid memories of Eric Lyons, and he is, of course, to many well-loved and a very fine architect, and of course a very fine president of the RIBA. I remember in '75, as a younger man and a backbencher in Dundee, he started his whistle-stop tour of branches round the country. And he came to Dundee, and we had a tremendous evening, informally, after dinner, sitting with Kate and Eric and a dozen or 20 members, just talking about architecture. And I have a very vivid memory of that. Norman Forster is delivering the first of these lectures, and for me, I may say, difficult to introduce. I've already tried it upstairs, where there are almost as many people at this moment watching us on closed-circuit television in the Florence Hall. I don't really want to keep you from what I know will be an enthralling lecture. 5 projects not yet publicly presented by Norman in London. Norman is, of course, one of today's most skillful and talented architects, one whose buildings are always new and fresh, and one who designs, for me, entirely from the macro to the micro. I enjoyed enormously my recent visit with Mary to Hong Kong, but I look forward, Norman, to every one of your new buildings in the same kind of way as I look forward to the new piece of music from one's favorite composer. I would like, without any further preamble, to invite you to lecture us now. Thank you.
Good evening. It's a great honor to be asked to give this inaugural lecture. I didn't really know Eric Lyons personally, but I had an enormous respect for the man, and it's a powerful reason to be persuaded to be here. As a student, I remember traveling around Scandinavia in the 50s and being really impressed not by the greats, the Jacobsons, but just by the standard of housing and landscaping, and really feeling why that kind of thing couldn't happen, that kind of quality couldn't be achieved, that kind of care in this country. And I remember going off to the States and coming back and starting practice here and moving around and looking at the span developments and feeling an incredible sense of wonder and stimulation that somebody had actually achieved what, as a student, seemed quite impossible. And I guess that Eric Lyons commanded my respect because he was an action man. He talked about things, but he also did them. He had a belief in the young, in students, when it wasn't really fashionable to have that interest. And the fact that he didn't build a great deal, but what he did build, he built with a particular kind of care and integrity and quality and zest. I heard that he was awarded more awards for housing than anybody else, which he quipped were really awards for bravery. I asked John Partridge what was really expected of me, and he said, well, I'd really like you to try and communicate something of really what makes you tick as an architect. I mean, the kind of things you believe in, your enthusiasms, observations, comments, or whatever, which I felt was really a pretty hard task. Felt it was easier to do that by talking about projects, recent projects, projects that we're engaged on at the moment. And so really I'd just like to try and fulfill that brief, as it were, by starting with the slides. Could I have the lights, please? What excites me? I guess it's really the ingredients of architecture. It's a bit in a way like a chef, fairly basic. And this restaurant in France maybe is a vehicle to make some observations. If a chef caters for people, because without people who generate his art, he has no function, then that's surely true of architecture. It's about light and materials, because without light you can't create spaces, see the materials, and light is very important. And this is a very beautiful restaurant, although it's very humble in its materials. It's also about movement, the movement of people, so it's about serving, and it's about the spirit of the place. And it's also about the site. Very beautiful site, next to the water. And it's about detail, because no detail is small. And some of the best meals I've had are really very humble affairs. And you don't need expensive materials or grand opportunities to have a feast. And that, I believe, is true of architecture. The thread of relatively modest commissions and opportunities, where the ingredients are really quite basic and humble, is a kind of continuous thread through the practice, and it's as alive now as it ever has been. And I think that this tiny shop for Hamlets, where the ingredients are a rather dismal double-story garage on the right-hand side of the screen there, and that tiny neck corridor of an entrance labeled Brompton Motors. Very dispiriting place. High ambitions, low budget, and very, very basic ingredients. In the same tradition, perhaps, as in the past, maybe trying to do a permanent building for a company like IBM on a budget that you'd normally associate with temporary buildings, or a blow-up structure, an inflatable structure for a struggling computer company, or trying to piece together the ingredients for a housing trust in an individual house for 3 families, where each family would be pushing to raise £1,000. That's fashionably called community architecture today. I think it's as worthy a cause as it ever has been. Absolutely vital. I worry a little about the divisions that seem to be generating between one kind of community architecture and another kind of community architecture, because basically architecture is surely about serving people, which is pretty fundamental. So the ingredients of Hamlet are really coming back to creating the space, using the light, and materials. Well, I guess emulsion paint is pretty high on the list here. Coming to grips with the scale, seeking a kind of integrity, integrating some of the things that would naturally come together, not demeaning the space by small cubicles, but rather taking mirrors, stretching it, trying to magnify the scale, create a noble place, and at the same time respond to the function of those smaller scale dressing rooms. Moving down smaller in scale to the Techno project, an Italian company that asked us to design some furniture for them, and seeking to, in a few slides, compress some 3 years' work. The one on the left implores us as a joint team of Techno and ourselves as designers to keep it simple. The analogy not being to go for the furniture equivalent of the Swiss penknife, which tries to do everything with all those functions, including the little sharp thing which I'm told is for taking stones out of horses' hoofs. I don't know how often that's used, but the idea of only actually using what you want. Lean and keen, light and fast, images, if you like, of a lifestyle. Impossible to separate those out from other aspects of design, slightly out of sequence there, back on course. Selecting from the many, many drawings that have been done on that project. Many by myself, many by others, in our own office, in Techno's office. And picking these really because they were the ones that Techno selected of a sequence, extracts from a sequence that I did to try and communicate some of the thinking. Really an inventory of pieces that would come together. Heavy dependence on steel tube for economy, speed, and strength, and junction pieces. But not to talk about the technology, rather the lifestyle. Two themes, the one on the left as we go through really being individual spaces individual pieces like sculpture in space. The sequence on the right-hand side being elements that would come together to make an environment, complete with its own services, its lighting. The last one was called by the director in Techno, the Last Supper, the big group around the conference table, moving down in scale around suppers, the idea that it would respond not only to the right-hand side, creating environments for workstations, dealer desks, and so on, but on the left, dinner by candlelight or coffee tables. And finally moving through to the two sample elements that were previewed in Milan. The freestanding table, many, many variations on it, and the kind of island units, the clusters that can make and create their own environments. The launch in Milan was a feast of very simple food, beautifully prepared by those amazing chefs. And if I use the chef and the food and the restaurant analogy, it reminds me that in some countries the chef is a more esteemed, more respected person. Certainly in Italy, certainly in France and other countries I can think of, Japan. That's not so true in this country. And what goes for chefs also goes for architects too. And I think it runs a little deeper than that. I think the respect and the esteem for people who make things and service things is also at a pretty low ebb, and has been for a long time. And I find that very difficult to believe, because the creation, the making of anything seems to me one of the most noblest professions. And if we have achieved anything as architects, it's because of a genuine humility and respect for the people who make things, in such a way that we endeavor to communicate, understand how they do it and why they do it and their processes. And I guess in that spirit, if I talk about the Techno project, albeit at a small scale, architecture in miniature, which is really what furniture is to us, then it is inconceivable not to be working on the factory floor with these individuals who are incredibly creative and very, very respected. Whether that's Franco on the right or his brother Carlo on the left. The fellow on the right makes Formula 2 cars in his spare time. Incredible people. I think that in that respect, we're probably closer, in true terms, to the craft tradition, because the reality is that buildings are, and have been for a long time now, totally dependent on factory production. The site is more and more the assembly point. You cannot turn the clock back. But that doesn't change anything. Nothing whatsoever has changed. Quality is an attitude of mind, and it's totally dependent on those people who make things. And if they don't have that respect, then it will show visually, and it does, more in some countries than other countries. Some meals are not humble, cozy, family affairs. They're grand state occasions, huge numbers, and they become more demanding because the distances are greater, and quality control is infinitely more difficult. Control of any kind is more difficult. And what goes for a banquet must surely go for a building too. especially buildings in a time of dramatic change. And I can't think of anything that signifies dramatic change in the 20th century more dramatically than an international airport. And so this sequence is extracted from presentations made to British Airports Authority in connection with our work on the third London airport at Stansted. And maybe looking at Heathrow on the left in the 1940s, and Heathrow as it is on the right now, says more about dramatic and volatile change than anything I could say. We went back through time. We contemplated the shift from an elitist, leisured class transport between the wars for few numbers to the explosion of mass travel, cheap travel for everyone as a prerogative, and everything that went with it, and all the stress. And it seemed that airports should not be about throughputs in terms of planes per hour, baggage per minute, but should be about people. I noticed coming to the office this afternoon, there was a kind of banner headline, "Man goes on rampage in Heathrow." The statistics around coronary arrests in airports is absolutely staggering. They are very stressful places. Nobody actually writes a brief and says, "Designer's the most tranquil airport in the world." But it seems that that should be the challenge, and that that should be compatible with the other side of the functional equation. Because if that's not about function, if the spirit of the building isn't about function, if the poetry of the building isn't about function, then what is function about? It's not just the water coming out of the taps. It should do that as well. We should take some things for granted. So, going back to the basics and trying to find some inspiration from other sources, the technology that actually generated the need for those buildings, I find it a very, very interesting sequence, which I haven't completely unraveled in my mind, but I suppose that other people more observant and more aware will have already, as it were, started to quantify it. But this full circle of an aircraft like the Wright Flyer, Kill Devil Hills, 1903, canard, no dependence, very little dependence on metal, composite, pusher configuration. And that the Burt Rutan designed proof of concept, reduced scale, flying prototype on the right of the Beechcraft Starship is exactly that. And whether it's in silicon chips or whether it's in building materials, then it seems that we're seeing this revolution of really back to basics. So what is back to basics in terms of an airport? Well, going back to an early airport, and this I think is either Dallas or Houston in the early 30s on the left-hand side. And you were in no doubt where you were, no problems of orientation. You arrived by car, this instance along a dirt track, and you saw the aircraft and you walked towards it. And when you came back, you saw the car and you walked towards it. Very, very simple. You didn't need graphic designers to try and lead you through a maze to negotiate the standard international airport. So we endeavored to see whether we could find that kind of clarity and order, because that seems to be a kind of prime road, bringing a sense of order into something that otherwise is anarchy and chaos. If that isn't also about architecture, it seems to me very fundamental. So here, the idea of a large room which would put people first. You would walk towards the aircraft, there would be a land side and an air side, clearly visible as such, seemed to be in the spirit of going back to basics. That diagram on cross-section was shown to the British Airports Authority Board about a year and a half ago, nearly 2 years ago, in this form, with the proposition that you would enter on the left and you would walk across towards the aircraft. Minimum walking distance, no level changes. The baggage would go down below, because the baggage doesn't know the difference if it has to change level, but people do. And it would also end up at the right point, because the baggage wants to get onto a truck which will take it to the aircraft. People want to get onto the aircraft at that level, or through some swift transportation system that will change the levels for them. In the final development, a track transit system. Also, the roof would let the light through, and you try and achieve the most beautiful quality of light that the resources, the funds, the materials would allow you. And that you'd put all the things that drive that building in the basement where you could get at them very easily. So nothing really got in the way. So you'd take all the cobwebs out of the ceiling, all that festoon work of ducts, heavy metal, engineers' battleground, fluorescent light tubes, all the things that, in my personal view, get in the way and mar the potential for creating something that would be more uplifting and more beautiful. That attempt at integration of the services, the lighting, into the structural fabric, that integration, I think is a relatively early preoccupation and picks up chords from the Lyons project, where the heating was interwoven into the floor fabric and the light tubes into the corrugations. And essentially, the space and the articulation, the modulation of that space by the structure was an important concern. And I think that that is something that has developed over a period of time. The more recent study here from the Frankfurt project shows the attempt to refine, to skinny down that structure, to hone it, and again within that plane to integrate the services, the lighting, natural light, artificial light, and also a concern about the way that that building would start to express itself more dramatically in terms of entrances than other attempts at that in the past, and also the way that it would relate to the ground. Coming back to that diagram, we can see a part of the building diagrammed on the left, so that at the base of those structural trees, which would enable you to have a structure wide span at 36 meters, that in economy terms would break that down halfway to 18 meters, shells which would admit the light. You would also get controlled shafts of sunlight. And then, as the lighting level diminished outside, gradually, the internal artificial light located at the base of the trees would gradually come up, so that that roof from the inside would act as a reflector. So you would get reflected light gently glowing and illuminating the whole space. The interest in light, I can pick back to this project in terms of trying to pull light, scoop light, reflect sunlight into the heart of a deeper building. This is the Olsen project in the early 70s. The manifestation of that idea developed later in terms of the bank with an external array of mirrors, sunscoop as we called it, relating to an internal array of mirrors at the top of that main space. Again, an attempt to transform the everyday use of a banking hall for cashing a check from something that would be a kind of humdrum experience to something that might actually be uplifting and that might attempt to sum up the spirit of that organization through the use of space. Many other things as well, but light is a powerful ingredient. An increasing concern about the way that functionally you enter buildings, so that the entrance will announce itself. And if I talk about integration here, the diagram on the left showing that the railway station, because this is linked to Liverpool Street, the railway station is pulled physically into the building, so it's not a remote station. The actual station is part of the airport. Again, trying to integrate and pull those transportation systems to knit them together. If if we look at the entrance here, this building intended to grow lengthwise, the attempt to suppress, to control the inevitable visual chaos of large-scale parking and coach movements by the, I suppose, an interpretation of the 18th century device of a ha-ha to actually depress it just enough so that it's out of the sight lines, and the building then sits on the high ground, which also enables economically that undercroft to be incorporated into the building. If that was the land side, this is the air side, and the air side which now handles the track transit system, which takes you, effects the changes of level and takes you to the satellites. And then a montage of that, giving an impression of how the building might feel at night. I've always had a personal interest in what I would call urban linkages. And I took this slide on the left of the Galleria, which is one of my favorite places and spaces, in 1958 as a student, and I've used it pretty continually and revisited many, many times, and been very fascinated by the way in which urban routes can penetrate through building blocks and add another sort of dimension and ingredient of public involvement in what would otherwise be private domains. The Nolli plan of Rome on the right-hand side, and some recent projects effecting a shift, if you like, a change, more varied opportunities. For example, the NEAM project here, which was a competition, was an international competition, was to develop for a combined gallery for contemporary art and the Mediathek on a site opposite the Maison Carrée, which is this astounding Roman temple here. On the site opposite there, a car park, originally occupied by an opera house built the last century, demolished by fire almost totally in 1953. Our proposition was that the space was great. The original building, which had since burnt down, just about got it right in terms of its height and massing. The spaces that were left on the edge of that were good streets, potentially be good streets, and that really it was fantastic and one should respect it and be informed by the scale of what had gone before. And the page on the right makes those points and is one of a number of pages that were prepared for the original competition report. And it's interesting that in a competition there can be such an extraordinary diversity of approaches. For example, in this newspaper cutting here is the scheme that we proposed, which recreated dimensionally the original facade, respected the geometry, recreated the streets around the edge, and left this space here totally alone as it was, even suggesting that they should keep the traffic running through it, for reasons that I won't go into now. Jean Nouvel, an architect who I respect enormously, proposed a scheme which in effect created a glass lake and opened up the whole space totally. Caesar Pelli, on the other hand, went right out and across the road and hugged the building. And Frank Gehry created a kind of organic mountain on the site with a kind of mediator of building between the temple and the site there. We were really seeking to bring the site back in many ways to what it was, and the red line on the right-hand slide there showing the possibilities of a linkage that could effect a shortcut through the building and around the building to bring together the two key ingredients in Nîmes, which is this amazing arena, Roman arena, and these extraordinarily beautiful gardens, Jardin de la Fontaine. And the building, as it developed over a period of time, was informed by the tradition of spaces and courtyards in traditional buildings in and around Nîmes, and was a powerful determinant around the idea to create the equivalent of that in the heart of the building as an open space with terraces, with steps, that would enable you as a member of the public to walk through the building and up to the roof terraces without necessarily paying, participating, feeling that you had to, as it were, go to a gallery or access the library or do all those amazing things that you can do in Mediatex, which would be an evening's conversation in itself and draw some very, very dramatic differences between attitudes and states of mind towards new generations between France and other countries, and this country in particular. Fascinating, peripheral conversation. Coming back to the architecture, the roof has been lifted off some of the spaces and reveals on this top floor a sequence of rooms, some tall, some skinny, some fat, a variety of rooms. No attempt to go for a flexible space, although quite possible in terms of a frame structure to reposition walls. The floor below for temporary exhibitions, having an emphasis on flexibility, but a deliberate sequencing of spaces here in this gallery. And again, very, very strong emphasis on top light. The routes you can start to see from the square up through to the roof terraces. You can also see that those activities which need light gravitate towards the top, and those more concerned with storage move down, and the building substantially digs into the ground, and then pulls back at the sides with many devices to get light through the edges down into the lower reaches of the building, coming back again to that humanizing quality of light, that quest to infuse the spaces in the building at whatever level. And in that quest, a great, I find, personal inspiration in traditional Japanese architecture, whether it's more recent traditional architecture or whether it's some of the hallowed places, like Roanji on the left, a traditional Japanese inn on the right. You are never in any doubt in orientation where you are. You're aware of a very beautiful quality of light, but interestingly not dependent on glass. Extraordinary beautiful qualities of translucency, relationship with the outside, and an attempt on this building to develop a palette of facade materials that would modulate light by grillages and enable you to see in, filter, provide insulation with layers that would also transmit light of a glowing nature, and in turn the atmosphere of that would change during the night. The entrances always pushed back on corners, recessed, small porticos for protection, for invitation. In many respects, some quite close parallels with the very economical structures. In this instance, on the IBM building, the attempt to find a low-cost structure, the equivalent of that in the south of France is a very simple concrete frame, 6 meters square. And for me, very much in an ongoing tradition of trying to find simple solutions, and generally a concern for the distribution of a building budget in terms of the priorities. The two slides here making the point about the manner in which the building can be entered, the gesture of a portico, the protection from the weather, the symbolic welcoming, and also the protection, the shading for the terraces, very much picking up a similar device in 20th century terms to the Maison Carrée itself, and also being informed by that tradition in France, and also particularly in the south, of the weather protection, the terrace, the very interesting sort of inside-outside, public-private world of that terrace in terms of the very urban and civilized outdoor cafe. Moving a little further north to the Langham, the BBC, the project, as we described it at the outset, a new headquarters for the BBC, which would have to work from the inside out. It would have to answer those very complex requirements, social and technological, of a broadcasting centre in the 20th century moving into the 21st century. It would obviously, in urban terms, on quite a sensitive side, quite a challenging side, have to work from the outside, the inside out, the outside in. And it's really on that urban context that I'm going to touch on, in a way not leaving the rest for granted. It's an important generator, but really shifting the emphasis and going back in time. What generated Portland Place, the view from Foley House, which originally sat on the Langham site, the transition through the Adam Brothers, the change from a cul-de-sac to a processional route to the 20s, somewhere in the middle, 1864, the blast of the existing Langham Hotel exploding on the site at the head of Portland Place, some of the shifts, social, like mass shopping, Regent Street, technological, the steel frame that made it possible, Portland Place that clad it, Portland stone rather, which then moved down as a cladding material into Portland Place, replacing the brick of Adam, which was in turn replaced before that by the stucco of Nash. In other words, a pattern, totally organic, evolving pattern of change. And very much in that spirit, the replacement of the Langham Hotel for the BBC. The project aborted due to a rationalization program which moved them from the center to the White City. And I guess that really we were responsible for that, because during the competition in our research, which we pursued with vigor after we were appointed, we noted the BBC had some 20 properties within walking distance of the site, and that they had in excess of 1 million square feet. And we suggested a rationalization program that would essentially, for good economical reasons as well as problems of communication, strip that away and consolidate them into a central London presence. Now, that process was taken further and consolidated out of the centre into White City and suburbia. It's out of the context of an architectural discussion. I wear a different hat as a license fee payer and have a view that maybe an institution as hallowed as the BBC should have a central London presence and set an example instead of pulling out to go to suburbia, to the dogs to White City, if you like. But that is another aspect. And far more interesting is really the urban challenge. And I think the linkage is an interesting one. The clues offered by the relationship of Cavendish Square on the left here, the linkages to All Souls, that very dramatic corner, it's a vista, it needs terminating. But on the other hand, it's a continuous route which goes around, which is very, very successfully terminated by Nash's All Souls at the north end here. And the model over there, leaving out many, many interim stages, shows the evolution of those routes and some of the devices that we've started to explore. A building that would sit quite reticently in the main facade line here, respecting the fact that the main termination from the south to the north, handled by All Souls, and trying in the spirit to respond to that here. Interestingly, once you had consolidated onto the existing broadcasting house and its extension here, and a new building here, then the center of gravity of that total development was right at this point here, and a very logical point at which to put the main vertical circulation, especially if you then link the two buildings together underground, so you could get good pedestrian access and good service access. It seemed that the Langham Hotel on the right-hand side had never really quite made up its mind in terms of the role that it was playing at the end of Portland Place. It was, at a first glance, absolutely symmetrical and would give you the impression that there was either a T-junction or a dead end. It wasn't quite symmetrical, but symmetrically enough to make you believe that. But the reality was really something else. This was a route that turned a corner, very, very important knuckle. And the attempt to bring that circulation together and to relate it as a vertical feature, and then, as you would start to turn the corner, to see the way in which that could open up and a dialogue take place between that building, the space it created, and All Souls, was a very, very interesting opportunity. The exterior of the building, the way that it could be informed by the inner workings, by the studio zones, by the needs for flexibility, the very, very complex internal arrangements which generated very large floor-to-floor distances, extraordinarily heavy loads, minimum spans which were still quite generous, led to a structure which was kind of very, very massive, very dominant. And a very conscious decision to pull that structure inboard and then to support the edge with a higher frequency edge necklace that would be expressed on the exterior, to break down the scale in urban terms and also break down the scale in structural terms to fewer, finer members. A device in a way that we'd used in an earlier building where we had hugged the edge of a site to be able to create a building that would be low and sympathetic in this winding medieval geometry of streets in Ipswich. So an edge necklace inboard, then a square geometry that would relate to the internal requirements. Very, very similar in spirit. But in this instance, demands in urban terms and in social technological terms much greater, and a breakdown expressed externally of the movement, the service, the inner organization of the building, breaking the scale down into individual blocks which would be high where they would need to be high, where the vistas were longer, were more powerful, were more compelling, would be more modest to relate to smaller scale neighbors around the Georgian Square. So you can see this build up and several scales, the scale of the individual block, the scale of the tower that separates them, the structure which then modulates that, and then in turn the panels and the mullions. And saying, as a belief, that this building should be in its external expression fixed. That the change that would take place within it, and that the facade could change in terms of the proportion of that which would be translucent, would be glass, but essentially it wasn't necessary for the exterior of this building to be an all dancing, all singing, totally movable. That was not necessary to achieve flexibility in terms of this kind of building. The way in which that would then express itself three-dimensionally, the manner in which those columns, as you viewed them more obliquely, would stack, would give something that would be more attenuated, more solid, was studied three-dimensionally, very large study models, many photographs. The roof of the building, very much in the spirit of the Willis-Faber building, and saying that really roofs should be for people. They should be to contemplate the view, they should be to walk out, sunbathe, and that basically the mechanical equipment can go somewhere else because it doesn't know the difference, like the baggage in the airport. So the idea of the undercrofts, of the service, of integrating and really being very discreet about that, and talking about the creation of a space that would work in public terms, that would be a meeting point where you could view exhibitions, where you could see television in action, watch broadcasting, go into layer after layer, deeper into the archives of special access clubs, or just meet for a coffee. A good place to be, a good meeting point. It seemed that that was really what a headquarters for an institution like the BBC should be now and into the next century. Accessible, open, participatory, and the exact opposite of what it might have been in the 1930s. The whole social interaction of groups within the overall umbrella of the BBC, very, very interesting. We were told at the outset it was something like a loose association of warring tribes, and incredible sort of rivalry. I mean, great competition, amazing creative hothouse of many diverse groups, and identities coming out like the signs on the door on the right, which at one point I tried to explain to myself as a kind of game of Russian dolls. The BBC would be like a big doll. You'd open it up and you'd find more dolls, and you'd keep opening them up and you'd find more breakdowns of individuals, in some cases small groups, teams, each with their own individual identity. And absolutely fascinating challenge. And I think that if it was Eric Lyons, who I was reading, was saying that you are never the same after a competition, any competition, then certainly this and any competition that we've participated in, whether we've won and built, lost the competition, won the competition and not built, then undeniably you are changed as a consequence of it. And you are all infinitely richer as a consequence of that experience. I have no doubt in my own mind about that. It was a terrific project. We had a wonderful working relationship with a great bunch of dedicated people. It's sad that the building isn't built, but in a way the building exists for us as a challenge that we fulfilled up to the point where we were allowed to work on it. The same brief, in some respects, has surfaced in Mexico City. Many, many differences, but many similarities. The site is totally different. It's in the foreground on the left and in the background on the right. It's 26 acres. It's not in the middle of a city. It's in the suburbs. It's next to the Azteca Stadium. It's not for a Mexican institution. It's an institution in one respect, but it's private. It's a building which the challenge was really to create a kind of magic in a world where you could go into that world through a protective outer wall. And it would be a kind of magic place. It's pointed out that magic is very important in Mexico. I believe that very seriously. And one of the magical qualities that was sought was the thing that makes this company tick is its ability to be many different things under an individual umbrella. And if it was the earthquake which made this building a necessity in that it demolished, tragically, a number of individual buildings in the earthquake impacted area in Mexico City, then bringing them all together on one site, but important to strengthen and to respect the individual identities of those particular companies. One of the inspirations which for me is a very, very powerful one is this. Some buildings which have no external form as such. I've tried to photograph the souk in Marrakesh, the Casbah there. Very difficult to actually find. It doesn't have an external form as such, but it's an amazing magic world inside of prime routes which break down into subsidiary routes, some of which end in cul-de-sacs, some of which lead you into other routes, and an amazing kind of richness and diversity of experiences. And the site has at its heart a very, very large quarry. I mean, it's something like about 50 feet deep, where this volcanic lava is exposed. One of the things which emerged in discussions with the client was the possibility, instead of blasting that, which is quite traditional, it is a very economical way of actually losing it, to take the quarry and to create a kind of secret place in the heart of the building where if you went down into it, you would actually cut off by sight lines the visions of the building around it. And that could be a focus. It could be a kind of stone garden. It could be a sculpture court. The company does own quite a lot of traditional stone, Mexican and earlier civilization sculpture, as well as an interest in contemporary art. So it seemed a very, very interesting possibility to make this one of the generators of the scheme. And on the left you can see that quarry on the site, and on the right-hand side the space which then opens to the sky and has at the heart of it this very kind of organic, deep quarry. And then the routes which go from main routes, which narrow down to subsidiary routes, ending courts, would enable this organization to have both internal and external spaces which would be customized, personalized, and would be individual, all within this kind of inner world. Under a graceful roof umbrella, there would also be a kind of catchment umbrella, literally, to be able to scoop the torrential rainfall and to channel it down the columns to a reservoir so that it would be self-sufficient. The idea of the undercroft, where you would have the heavy mechanical plant, where you could change it, where you could get at it, where you would lift this building above this quite difficult site, because the problem with lava is you don't know where the fissures, where the cracks, where the cavities are. It can be dense and you maybe can build straight on it, or you can go right down and it's like a crunchy bar. You can just go straight through it. You can hit a large hole. So within this overall umbrella, on top of the undercroft, which is for cars, which is for plant, you have the opportunity of creating quite large, generous spaces. You can stack offices in, everything is walk up, and under top light at the apex of these, the structural unit incidentally being this unit here, taking full advantage of a very sophisticated concrete industry, an awareness that you really should not, could not import a great deal into Mexico because of all kinds of economic barriers and penalties. So optimizing on the capabilities of that industry using steel, very modestly here, part of that composite structural approach. And as I say, within that, flexibly, you can put studio boxes, which, where they do require their own overhead local servicing, again, is within that overall unifying roof umbrella. Some of the studies on the roof, the structure, the spaces, changed since this drawing was done. At the last meeting, a very, very clear decision taken with the client that basically there shouldn't be a protected outside area around there. The glass should go right to the edge. It would be far more dramatic. You get a much more dramatic contrast between the world outside, the nature of torrential rainfall, the quarry, and then the inner world of this particular complex. And finally on that scheme, some of the early model studies fronting the building and sharing the car park with the Azteca Stadium, because that rather usefully works on a time cycle. At the peaks for this building, the Azteca Stadium isn't used, and the reverse is also true, so it can optimize on that parking resource and creates a lake reflecting pool, and you enter over bridges, enter the main entrances is here, subsidiary entrance to audience studios, more private aspects separated along that facade, which is a kind of pedestrian facade as opposed to the road facade on the other edge. Back into Europe, into France, Nancy, a commission to examine an urban study as a related part of a project to provide a new community hall that would attempt to cope with the inner city problems of Nancy. Nancy, an amazing city, beautifully preserved, extraordinary 18th century core, which is here, and the site to the right of the water there, and also slightly to the left of it, at the break point between the inner city and the outer city, a decayed area, declining industries, including the canal, industries around it, and the challenge really to transform that and to knit together the outer city, bring it closer, try and alleviate a number of the social problems that they've found themselves with. This is the Place Stanislas, an extraordinary 18th century space, which we studied, along with the other related spaces, analyzed them in dimensions, cross-section, planting trees, floor textures, to see what clues might emerge from those in terms of the site in question. Place d'Alliance, its dimensions, cross-sections, and moving into the site, working with the community and identifying those activities that might be appropriate on that site. The initial commission, which this generated out of, was an invitation to design a large meeting hall for some 4,000 people and a room for 1,000 people next to it that would cater for wide-ranging events, from dinners to conferences, rock concerts, whatever, and that could be a generator that would overcome some of the social difficulties and also be a pilot project to attempt to revive the ailing steel industry, which has quite a strong presence in Nancy. So the activities there range from housing to a regional government centre, the hall in question, studios, galleries, and our proposition was really rooted in some very, very simple premises. The walk along the water was really absolutely fantastic, a great place to be. It seemed that that should be emphasized, reinforced, and informed by the block dimensions in the rest of Nancy, the historic part, which seemed to work very well, be very accommodating, a very, very simple subdivision into blocks, which could then be capable of being developed over time, different points in time, by different architects as appropriate. And also saying that you could do an amazing amount now simply by just planting trees. There is this incredible tradition in this city of tree planting, and it would be transforming as an element. So by planting trees, by accepting the imposition of a very, very simple grid, by using what was there, some very good buildings, the one on the right is fantastic, keep them, use them, integrate them. And some of the studies, as for instances, looking at that, courtyard housing here, again feeding off the local tradition of smaller courtyard housing, suggesting ways in which some of the traditional devices of Nancy, which has a series of ports, so you actually gateways at various points of the city that you physically enter through, and suggesting the possibilities in a regional government centre here of building around and actually creating a new gateway through this existing road, which would be preserved, a very important traffic route and bridge. In other words, making the best of what was there and enabling something that could develop over time in a tradition that was familiar. Now, Nancy is a lot of other things as well. It's the birthplace of Jean Prouvé. It figures in any study of Art Nouveau. There are some extraordinary and beautiful structures which sit there neglecting, waiting to be discovered. I suppose Jean Prouvé is one of one's personal heroes, as is Le Corbusier, as another French hero. I'm fascinated by coming across, by chance, this slide taken in 1963, 23 years ago, from almost identically the same viewpoint as I took the slide on the right earlier this year. And I think it probably makes the point that if a building really has something, then that building is right at any stage. It's right during its construction, it's even right as a ruin. Now wonderfully restored. I was intrigued to come across a book which I bought recently by Corbusier on aircraft, and intrigued by his love affair with aviation, which I share passionately. It was also coincidental that a lot of the conversations I had with Jean Prouvé were about gliding. He was a passionate glider freak. And I find that the analogies, the links with aviation, with other lateral industries, quite intriguing, related to architecture at many levels. I find the imagery of violence quite sinister and quite frightening, awesome. And I think that I share, like I'm sure everybody else would share, Bucky's admonition that the challenge was to harness the industry and the energies of killing people into works for living in. And at one point when it was said of the bank that it has enough aircraft floor in it to fit out 70 jumbo jets, and a good friend actually, who's head of the School of Architecture in Hong Kong, quipped on one occasion, it has all the materials of a jumbo jet and yet it can't fly. I think in a way he was missing really some quite vital points about the relationship between the aircraft industry, the armaments industry which it fuels, and the building industry. Something like the conservative estimate in the office is 25%. I think it's personally much higher. But even if it's only 25% of the cost of this building in terms of its components are directly related to those industries and couldn't have been achieved without a transfer from those industries, I find very heartening. I find that there's personally an optimistic link in that relationship. The fact that it took 10 years for Hexcel to get the technology out of Boeing into the floor systems which are used in this building, and now Boeing are going back to the building industry because they can learn something from that. The fact that the cladding couldn't have been done without a direct computer link to McDonnell Douglas, and the cutting tools, the Trumpf tool developed presumably by a man called Trumpf, which can cut to an accuracy of 4/1000ths of an inch, metal 6 inches thick, and that all that is linked back into McDonnell Douglas. And now McDonnell Douglas are going back to the building industry because there is more to learn from the execution of that. The fact that the tooling was really developed initially for mass production runs, and you find that you can use it economically because of its computer links to customize one-offs within the scale of one building quite economically, again I think is a very, very interesting development. So prefabrication does not mean repetition and standardization. It can mean total customization and economically customization, which opens up a whole new rich world of possibilities. I put this in really for Charles Jenks, because there was a forum last night at the Royal Academy and he completely threw me with a question which I couldn't answer. I'm slightly ashamed to say that I got rather irritable and said that I thought it was a banal question, which was totally unfair, very rude, and in actual fact I've been thinking about the question ever since. And the question was, which I declined to answer, was what proportion of the cost is the structure of the bank building. And the other question was, what is the aspect ratio? We didn't actually use the aspect ratio. He said, what is the proportional relationship between the height of that space and its width relative to Gothic cathedrals? And then he totally blinded me with statistics around one cathedral was this, another cathedral was that. And turning that question over since then has produced this particular pair of slides. Well, if Charles is in the audience, I'd like to inform him that the percentage of the structure on this building is 20%. It's 1/5 of the cost of the building. And that set me thinking, because it seemed to me really rather low. Not trusting to intuition, we set about a chase of quantity surveyors. And Ken and Dave in the office were sort of phoning quantity surveyors and coming back, and they said, we've spoken to 4 or 5 quantity surveyors, one's an American estimator, this guy from there's even one downstairs, all come up with the same answer. It shouldn't be 1/5, it shouldn't be 20%, it should be between 30 and 35%. So in relative to a quantity surveyor's estimate based on the traditional office building, it's a relatively low percentage. The main space is the same width as Amiens Cathedral, but I'm told it's a little higher, and that the aspect ratio of Amiens is 2.5, its relationship of its width to its height, as opposed to the banking hall, which is an aspect ratio of 3. The question related to cathedrals of commerce, and for statistical purposes, I hope that that's provided a satisfactory answer. If those 2 slides are really for Charles Jenks and the very stimulating processes that he set off unwittingly in train today, which challenged us, then the next 2 are for me. Because it's all about architecture, it's all about coming back to John Partridge, what makes me tick. It's about places and spaces. It's about things. It's about the process of making things and using things. It's about the process of being stimulated. It also brings you back, I can't really say brings you back down to earth, but it does make you aware of the knife edge of your frailties. And I guess that if you're passionate about something, then it's the best reason I can think of for doing it, for believing in it. I could indulge in all kinds of parallels between flying and architecture. I do architecture because I enjoy it, because I believe in it. And I'm here this evening because I believe that Eric Lyons had a tremendous zest and appetite for it, and that commands my respect. Thank you. Do I stay up here? Thank you.
Norman, thank you very, very much. What a wonderful wide range of projects, each architecturally different and standing alone, and yet with so much continuity and philosophy of approach. Thank you for stimulating us and taking us flying with you. I'm going to ask John Partridge now to thank Norman Forster.
Well, a lot has been written and said about Norman Forster in the last few months, particularly particularly since the opening of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank and the three-man exhibition at the Royal Academy. These have all brought forth volumes of words, and in this context it's very difficult for me to say more. This Eric Lyons lecture has provided Norman with a platform to break, I think, new grounds in communicating ideas. When we asked him what made him tick, we didn't know it was going to bring forth such a wealth of interesting enthusiasm and ideas. I think we're a little nearer to the answer of what makes him tick. I think almost everything makes him tick. People, the making of things. He gave me, a marvelous phrase for a vote of thanks, because he referred to the fact that you don't need an expensive materials to have a feast. I think we've had a great feast this evening. Maybe we've had a few expensive materials as well, but we didn't need them. I asked him as well to expand on his architectural philosophy. But not this evening through the, he's just touched on the great works of the last few years, Ipswich and Sainsbury Centre, and ended with those marvellous shots of the Hong Kong Bank. But I think I have been a little thrown this evening by the mention of all those marvelous things, metaphysical things, like magic and passion, which we don't hear enough about in architecture today. I asked him to talk about the buildings that were on the drawing board and the buildings that are not yet realized, and he has done so. And he's shown us how he can range from the smallest type of project, the techno projects, the Hamlet shop, to the larger projects. I think for the first time I've really heard him talk about the BBC, a little more en passant, as it were, but we regret its passing. Could it be that Langham Place has lost as Aztec has gained? I think there's some similarities, but the challenge of urban context, the diverse needs of people in a different city, the commodity and spirit of different social and economic cultures, another tradition, another history. These are all things that Norman Foster feeds on and picks up and gets excited about and excites everybody else around him. Nothing comes off the shelf in this very remarkable office. Everything is thought afresh and is thought of in a penetrating way. I wrote a few notes, I thought, about Norman Foster's stance in architecture. How can you call about stance for somebody who's so quick on his feet and quicksilver in his thinking? He does have a position in architecture, but stance is the wrong word, and I'm at loss to discover what the right word is. Certainly there is style, but it's not a style in any sense that high-tech is a static thing. There are no rules to it. The rules are in the energy with which he infuses into his work, in which he determines to press structure, technology, and ideas to the full and into the future. I think the way in which he's responded and is still responding to a multitude of diverse challenges of context and place is one of the great fascinations for this evening. How he uses rational thinking while he's talking to absorb and feed on external ingredients of his projects, and how he distills ideas and how he applies design skill through the application of technology. I think we all look forward to the realization of these next projects of Nîmes, of Nancy, and of Mexico. And I know there are, and of Stansted, of course, on our own home ground. And I know there are others coming along in both the West and the Eastern world. I think another fascination which he didn't quite touch on very much, and thank goodness he didn't really, was his political skill. I mean political with a small p. No architect can work without buildings to build. And Norman Forster, he's not only got the tenacity in political terms to carry through these major international projects, but he has a great skill in acquiring them in the first place. Nobody here could refuse him a job with that silver tongue that he has used tonight. Many of you will have heard him speak before. You will have known to expect this charismatic vitality, but this evening has been really exceptional. I think we've seen a new dimension. We've watched him move from top gear into overdrive and back again into first gear, and then fly away with disarming elegance. I'm exceedingly glad I made a few notes beforehand, because I couldn't keep up with making any notes while he was talking. I'm sure that he will not mind if I just say one or two few words about the Eric Lyons Memorial Fund. Could I say how pleased we are to see Kate Lyons here this evening, and members of the Eric Lyons family, including Richard. The fund was set up initially by members of the Association of Consultant Architects, together with members of the family, but it is not limited to members of ACA to give to or to benefit from it. This lecture is the first of a series of events that we hope to sponsor if funds are available. And to begin with, we've thought of a lecture on a yearly basis, but we hope to do much more. Eric Lyons was not only chairman of ACA for 2 years, he was also a very determined, dynamic president of the RIBA, and he was also a marvelous architect. Those of us who wanted to set up this fund felt that we needed something to commemorate him beyond the relatively small output of excellent buildings, mostly housing, by this very gifted man. He was very forthright, as has been said, and he was very much a champion of the young architect. Not only did he change the direction of ACA, so it is now an extremely important and effective part of the architectural scene, to some degree he changed the RIBA, and he changed the way in which architects work. The way in which he practiced himself was in advance of his time. He made things happen, and that we have seen tonight. Norman Forster makes things happen and believes in people who make things happen. So I hope this fund will keep his memory alive. I hope the profession, and particularly younger members, will feel that this initiative was worthwhile. If anybody here wishes to give to the fund, there are leaflets, and indeed these are covenant, placed at strategic points near the entrance. I could say that we have in the document on the fund that you can obtain, in the last year or so, we've been very fortunate indeed to add to the trustees Cecil Elson, who has been an invaluable source of inspiration and help to the trustees, and has been extremely energetic in helping to get this off the ground. So in thanking you, Norman Forster, for this most exciting evening, set most of us off on cloud 9, I would always also wish to thank those who have remembered Eric Lyons and given to the fund, and made it all possible this evening. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the evening. Can I announce before you leave next Tuesday's lecture here? Nigel Coates of Branson Coates will be speaking here next Tuesday evening at 6:15 and has taken as his title London Burning, Tokyo Rising. May I bid you all here and those upstairs watching us on television good evening.